So today for today's big topic, one of the things I'm trying to do with the show these days is kind of have like a single big topic that we kind of dive into and dissect in the world of, in this world. And today I wanted to talk about the idea of moving things forward. This concept of when and how to move the game forward comes from a larger topic about pacing in our RPGs. There's two quotes that I think are pretty relevant to this. One is in Monty Cook of Monty Cook Games says that understanding how pacing works in TTRPGs may be the most important skill that a GM can have. That really trying to understand how pacing works, how to move pacing, how to handle pacing is one of the most, if not the most important trait that a GM can have. Another one was a quote from Kobold Guides to Game Mastering, I believe it was, and it was actually a friend of Wolfgang Bauer, I believe, who said that a lot of times playing a role-playing game is like a 15 minutes of excitement packed into a 4-hour bag. And that kind of gets to this, like, sometimes the game can be kind of boring. If you have a lot of players and those players want to do a lot of stuff and you have a lot of things going on, the action can kind of lag a little bit. 4 hours can actually be a long time. So the idea of pacing overall is really, really important. This can include things like the upward and downward beats and all of the different kinds of literary beats that you find in Hamlet's Hit Points by Robin Laws. It includes generally how to deal with pacing, but there's really one aspect of pacing, and I actually had two patrons recently who asked basically the same question about pacing, which was when I'm in my game and I have some players that are having a good time or the story is there, but I feel like that the things are lagging, that I want to move things forward. The players are kind of okay with it, but they want to take more time with things. They want to do stuff, but really we want to move the game forward. What do I do about it? How do I handle that? So I thought it would be worth talking about this concept. And I'm not going to necessarily offer like the pure end all be all of solutions for this. It is a hard problem, which is why we are digging into it as deeply as we're going to dig into it. But hopefully we can kind of get our thoughts together about it, come up with some ideas, maybe have a few things that we can try in our games to see, like, can it help move things forward? A lot of times when I'm thinking about this concept of moving things forward, I think about like in Japan on the subways. I've never been to Japan, but I've seen videos of it where during rush hour, people are trying to pack themselves into a subway car, and there's actual people with giant shields that are like pushing them in and stuffing them in. And sometimes I feel like that in my D&D game where you're like, you have this, the players are kind of moving along and they're doing stuff and they're like getting involved in the stores, or they're talking to this favorite NPC, or they're getting involved in games at the bar, and you're like, you've got your big acrylic sheet, you're like, move forward, come on, let's go. Some of it I feel is like that. We have to be the one that's kind of shoving the game forward. And part of that means sometimes our players are not going to necessarily be happy about it because they were enjoying that thing they were doing. They were enjoying their bit of downtime. They wanted to run that game at the table. And you're like, we got to move things forward. But part of the reason we want to move things forward is because they might be having a good time, but other players may not be. Other players may be bored. Other players may be disconnected. They may be off on their phones or doing something else, or maybe they're just sitting there staring at the ceiling or falling asleep. You don't really know. So one of the tricks with pacing is that it's different for different players, and dealing with that is going to be a tricky spot. So the real problem is that sometimes things slow down in our game. That we can see it happening. We as GMs, we know things are slowing down. If we don't know that things are slowing down, well, that's kind of another problem, which is the players are bored, but we think things are going okay. That's not always great, but we kind of get this feeling of like, have things happen, always be moving towards action. What's something the characters can do? Now, some of the players also know what's happening. You have some where like, all I want to do is swing a sword and hit a skeleton. And there's no skeletons to swing swords at when I'm wandering around in town. So you know that some of the players are into it. Some of the players are into what's going on, and then the pacing isn't an issue for them. Sometimes it is an issue. Time is ticking. You have a limited resource. You have a limited time for the game that you want to run. And even if you're running an ongoing series that's continuing, you still want to have stuff happen. You still want to move things forward. You still want to have things going on. Your cool conclusion, if you're running a one-shot game, or even if you had an idea about, hey, I was going to have a big climactic fight at the end of a session, that time is getting closer and closer. What are you going to do is like, time, you thought this thing that was only going to take 45 minutes ends up taking an hour and a half, or this thing that was only supposed to take 10 minutes is now taking 45 minutes. What are you going to do? How are you going to manage that? So that's a real issue. Why does this happen? Why is pacing a problem with this? And some of it is that some players are taking their time with their scenes. It's honestly, it's really, really hard when you have a lot of players. If you have more than 4 players, pacing is going to be a concern, because those players want to have their time in the spotlight. They want to do things. They want to understand things. They want to dive into the game, but there are 6 of them. 5 of them or 6 of them. And when there's that many players, that amount of spotlight time is going to take up a lot of time in the game. The easiest thing to do to improve the pacing of the game is have fewer players. If you have 4, that's really great. If you baseline your group at 4, but you have a couple of people that, that can work too. I tend to have 5 or 6 players, right? I tend to have a larger number of players, but I can tell you, for those of you who have more than 6 players, you're in a rough spot. It is going to be really hard to keep that game exciting and interesting and moving forward when you have as many players as 7 or more. Really, really hard to do. 6 is my absolute limit. Decision paralysis often causes this problem. We put a lot of choices in front of the characters. The players have to make their individual choices, which is already hard. And for some people, it's just hard to make choices overall. You can see this with players who play like spellcasters, and they take a lot of time on their turn to try to figure out exactly what spell they want to do. They're sort of maximizing and optimizing their options. They're kind of thinking things through. They run through hypothetical scenarios, and then they change their minds. Some people, it's just harder to make decisions like that. And a lot of time, the people where it's harder to make decisions tend to pick classes that are harder to make decisions for. They don't pick a fighter where they just swing their sword every time. They pick the wizard who's got lots and lots of options. Decision paralysis is at an individual level is one thing, but then you get a group level where you say like, hey, everybody, where do you guys want to head to next? You have these 5 options. I had this happen in my game yesterday. We have these 5 options about where you want to go. They're hemming and hawing about, 3 want to go one way, 2 want to go another. They kind of talk about it. Then they remember that with some other subquests that they want to go on. That sort of analysis paralysis can be really hard. And the more people that are involved, the harder it's going to become, right? It's not even just one person. Then another one is sort of the constantly checking everything for every clue, every treasure, every trap, every secret door that goes on. The nice thing is there's a relatively easy solution for this that we'll get into. But sometimes when they're exploring an area, they want to explore everything. They want to go to every nook and cranny of the dungeon. They want to check every nook and cranny of every chamber that they go to. They want to roll checks on everything, and that can take a long time. Luckily, that's a little bit easier to deal with. Combat can take a really long time. Again, 6 players, 6 characters, higher level, they have lots of different options. The monsters have to get harder to account for that. So battles can take, an hour and a half, depending on what kind of system you're running. It can take a long time for battles. Then there's a vicious cycle. This one I don't think is really as well recognized, which is the vicious cycle of losing attention. That what happens, especially in online games, and I think this is a bigger plague for online games than it is for in-person games, but it can happen in in-person games too. And what happens is that things slow down a little bit, and then some players disconnect. They pick up their phone, they go play, a video game like on a little handheld system. They get distracted with other things, right? Maybe they even are distracted with things that are in the game, like, oh, I'm going to go look at what my next subclass is, or I'm going to go optimize what items I've got. You pick which items I'm going to equip. So they might even be connected to their own character, but they're losing track of the story. And then suddenly they get drawn back into the story, but they've lost track of what's happened. So now you have to freshen them up on what just happened. And that takes time. And then while you're doing that, other people are getting disconnected. So it creates this vicious cycle where things get slow, so people disconnect. And then because people are disconnected, it gets slower because you have to bring them back in again. It's really hard to handle. The nice part is that vicious cycle reverses if you keep pacing going. If you can keep engaging people before they've fully disconnected, then you can bring them back in, and then it's easier for them to reconnect to what's going on. The other one is being very quick and good about giving people the information they need in order to reconnect quickly. That's something that can work. Then the other one is like a lot of times if you're playing a published adventure and the published adventure has lots of material in it and you feel like you have to run all that material, but it's really kind of boring. You know it's boring. They know it's boring, but you're going through it anyway because the adventure has it. I see this most often with organized play adventures where I see GMs that feel like they have to run everything that's in an organized play adventure and then they have to cut off the end of the adventure. That's probably my biggest pet peeve with organized play adventures is when DMs will run what I call the boring middle, right? Oh, we're going to run a big skill challenge in order to cross this muddy wasteland to get to the boss, but now we don't have time to run the boss fight, so we're just going to call it right here. That drives me bananas. All right, so we've got kind of some ideas about what some of the issues are with pacing, but what are some of the solutions? What are some of the things that we can do to help with this? So for combat, let's start with combat. Combat, there's some easy specific things that we can do. 1, lower the monster hit points. Think about those dials of monster difficulty. The dials of monster difficulty are the number of monsters, the hit points of the monsters, the amount of damage they do, and the number of attacks they have. If you need to speed up the pacing of a battle, particularly after the battle has crossed over the point where the characters clearly have the upper hand and they're having a good time, turn that dial, turn the hit point dial. It means the monsters can fall over a little bit faster than they would normally. That increases the pacing. You've already hit the exciting peak of the battle, and now it's the cleanup. Don't make the cleanup last 2 more rounds just because the characters missed a couple of times and now the creature has 8 hit points left and they're only doing 5 damage. That is the most common way to tweak the dials. And the one that I think that the fewest people have problems with is turning the hit point dial down in order to end a battle early. It's really easy to do. You can do it completely behind the screen. You're not, very rarely are you going to have players who even notice it's happening. And if they do, they're probably recognizing like, yeah, we want to end this battle too. That to me is far better than saying we're going to call the battle right here, which again, I've heard many organized play DMs. Instead of just breaking characters saying, let's call the battle, let them do their final blows. Just make them final blows. Sometimes though, if a battle is going long or it's going to go long, you have a lot of players, they're high level, what you can do is lower the hit points but increase the damage. Make them more what they call glass cannon-y, right? Glass cannon is the idea that they do lots of damage but they shatter very easily. So you can lower the hit points but increase the damage. Drop an extra D6 damage or 2D6 damage on their attacks but lower their hit points. That way the threat is still there. These guys are still really dangerous. You're taking a lot of stuff. You're taking a lot of damage. There's a lot of risk. You get really scared. Damage scares players. When characters get hit with lots of damage, that freaks them out. But if you can drop them quickly, like, oh, thank God we got rid of that guy. He was doing like 96 damage to me. So that's definitely one. An area where pacing can really fall down is chasing enemies that run away. So one of the problems of having monsters flee, which would seem to be a good way to have a battle end early, is the monsters run away, is players want to chase them. And now you have this other pacing thing where the monster's trying to get away, the characters are chasing them, and it just goes on and on and on. So one way is to make it very clear. The monsters are going to flee and you're not going to be able to keep up. You're taking away some agency, but you're doing it really quickly and you're doing it for a good reason, which is just don't chase them. The alternative is instead of chasing, they surrender. Just don't get into one of these weird ass, we're going to torture the kobold for information things. That's a good thing to handle in your session 0. And make it easy for them to rehabilitate or say like, just get out of here, but won't ever want to see you again. And don't make them pay for that. If the players make the choice of mercy, don't pay back mercy by having those monsters come back. And then they're like, I guess we should have tortured that kobold to death. In my opinion, that's not a good way for the game to go. I don't like it. I'm not going to have it in my games. So when a kobold says, please, I'll tell you my information, just let me go, and they actually go. I think the only time I went against that was when it was a vampire kobold, and they really should have just killed the vampire, and instead they got information, the vampire kobold came back. So even in my circumstance, I still, from time to time, will change how that goes. But be careful with monsters who run away, because a lot of times your players are going to chase those monsters, so make sure they either have a clear way to get away where the characters aren't going to chase them down, or choose something else. And I've already talked about don't do the call it right here. For exploration, we're kind of covering these in sort of the easiest to deal with to the hardest to deal with. When I talked about like the problem of players who really want to explore every single chamber in a dungeon, and then for every chamber want to explore every nook and cranny. And this is a real easy, there's an easy solution. I don't know if anything is truly easy, but here's one that I find works really well that a lot of GMs don't do, which is break character and tell them they've explored everything. You see this in like dialogue trees in video games where like this character has told you everything they're going to tell you. You have thoroughly searched this room. You are convinced that there are no secret doors, that you've discovered all the treasure, everything's here. And you can even jump ahead of them doing the search, right? If after they've cleared out a room, you say a quick cursory search of the room, a good thorough search of the room tells you there is nothing else here to find other than what you have found. And then what are they going to do? Say, oh, I keep searching. You're like, same thing, right? Like the players are not going to say, well, I search and I search and I search and I search. Like, you're like, no, I'm serious. Out of character, there's nothing else here for you to find. And you can do the same thing with the whole dungeon, that once they fought the final boss, one of the things you could do is say, after destroying the final boss and going through the rest of the dungeon, you find the following treasure, or you found the following information, and then just abstract the rest of the exploration of a dungeon in order to move things forward. Once they've hit that key conclusion, once you think that the pacing in the game says, it's time to move on, let's not worry about exploring the whole rest of the dungeon, that you can just tell them what the characters discovered while they explored the rest of the dungeon very, very quickly and get on instead of going room to room to room. Unless you really feel like going room to room to room is interesting and is exciting and is the big part of the game and is what you want the players to focus their time on. Now, it does mean that like if you're one of the folks that worries about attrition, that worries about characters aren't doing too much stuff fully rested, but if it's after a boss fight, just skip the rest. I wouldn't worry too much about saying like, well, I need to let them go through the rest of the dungeon so they'll hit traps, which lowers their hit points, so it's a little harder. It's not worth sacrificing the pacing of the game in order to have them have fewer hit points at the end of something. Just tell them. This concept of just tell them when they've done something. That, tell, don't show. Instead of going through an entire dungeon, just tell them what they found. Instead of making them run a bunch of perception checks and a bunch of investigation checks, just tell them what they find. Not all the time. Again, we're talking about doing this when the feeling of pacing is starting to lag. That when you think you need to move stuff forward, that is the time to just cut to the chase. You found everything in here. Let's move on. So what about other forms of decision paralysis? This is the really big problem. You have certain players that spend a lot of time in the decisions that they're figuring out, or as a group, they all have trouble figuring things out. And it can be really tough. One of them is to make sure that you as the GM help facilitate that conversation. And you can do so by really clarifying what the options are in front of them. So you can always leave things for if they come up with other ones, you can drop them in, but then you might need to say like, look, that 7 is probably too many. You have a feeling that these 3 options really aren't viable right now, but these are the 4 options that are really viable. These are the ones that you're going to want to follow. You can take a bit of a heavier hand with this, as long as you're offering meaningful and relevant choices anyway. If you're giving them 4 choices that are all big ones, that gives them a good direction of what they want to do. Clarifying those options, writing them down. If you're playing in an online game, you can actually like paste them into whatever your text window is. So all of the players can look at what the options are. They can read them. They can think about them while the other players are doing the same thing, but it's very clear what they are. It's very clear why they would do those. The options are clear, the goals are clear, everything is well understood. You've helped refine it as the facilitator for this discussion. That gives them a better chance to follow through. If you kind of sit back and say things like, well, where do you want to go now? And then you rely on them to decide like, well, what are our options? And then you're going to eat up a lot of conversation time. That pacing is going to drop really low. It's going to take a long time. You can skip, unless you really think that is interesting, and that the players think that's interesting, you can condense that way down by being the facilitator, saying, as you sit there in this campsite, thinking about where you're going to go ahead, the following 4 options really become clear to you. You can go to the sewers and figure out why people are going missing in the sewers. You can go to the old cemetery and figure out why dead are coming back to life in the old cemetery. You can investigate the strange obelisk in the Demon's Bowl, or you can investigate the other strange obelisk at the land of gray spires, right? And like, oh, okay, we know what we need to do. We know where we need to go. These are our 4 choices. What do we want to do? That really helps. The clarifying really helps. Make sure the players have all of the info they need. Do they have everything that they need in order to make those choices? Do they know why they're going there? How it ties to their larger quest line? What they need to accomplish there? Make sure all that's really clear to them so that they can make those choices. Then eventually you can stop and say, instead of let them converse and talk about why they'd pick one over the other, but then at some point stop and say, just let's do a cursory vote and see where people stand, and go through the players, particularly starting with your quiet players, and ask them, where would you want to go of these options, and keep track. And you could do even sort of rank choice of like pick a couple and then see of those couple, like which ones tend to correlate more with another. Then once you've come up and you say, yeah, it looks like you guys all want to go to the sewers to see why people have gone missing in the sewers, then you can say, is everybody okay with that? Is everybody at least, can everybody live with that result? Because sometimes you might make a choice, particularly if it's a choice that you cannot come back from, where one of the players is like, I really don't want that. I really don't want that. And then you might need to go back and try to figure out how you can come to an agreement that everybody can agree to, and say, yeah, maybe it's not my ideal, but I'm fine with it. That's really what you're aiming for. It's not necessarily that every player is perfectly happy with the choice, but that every player is okay with the choice. You don't want to have it where one player is just, man, I did not want to do that at all, and that was the choice we made, and now I'm feeling disconnected from the game. I don't like what's going on. You want to bring that back in and stop and say, then re-scope the conversation to try to find a way that everybody can come to an agreement that is at least palatable to them. The independent role-playing game Shadowdark RPG actually has a couple of interesting ways to handle pacing and exploration. How do you keep things moving forward? There's actually kind of 3 different things that Shadowdark brings to the table in this that I think are all useful and are useful in other RPGs as well, if you can figure out exactly how to drop them in there. One is that you're always on initiative, which means you're always going from player to player to player. Even if you're doing scenes in towns, conversation scenes, you're still going around. That's making sure that everyone is staying involved. And it's also making sure that no one person has too much of the spotlight time. That's a really good way to keep pacing going when you have some players that are taking up more time than others with spotlight time. Another way for exploration that Shadowdark handles it is that things like torches, which are very important to keep away the danger of the dark, are timed in game and timed in the world. So you have like a stopwatch or a clock that says you have 60 minutes on this torch. When the torch runs out, this thing goes. Now you could take the clock concept from Blades in the Dark and the Powered by the Apocalypse games, where like certain things are scaling up. You can actually use a real game clock to show how things are scaling up in the world, that things that they want to do, things that they need to be able to accomplish, the time is ticking, and it's ticking in real world time, which means the players need to be moving forward a little bit faster if they want things to go. And again, another one from Shadowdark RPG is the idea of using random encounters. The little trick with random encounters, they work well for Shadow Dark because Shadow Dark encounters can be very, very quick, and the danger is always kind of always kind of there. Adding random encounters as a way to push pacing isn't necessarily ideal for like a game like 5e because those battles are now going to take extra time too. You've actually made things longer instead of shorter. But random encounters can be one of the ways that you can kind of keep the pressure moving forward to try to keep characters going in a particular direction. So those are kind of the big things that I've been thinking about when it comes to how you can help keep the pacing of the game moving forward, how you can move things forward. If you have other ideas, if you have certain circumstances, certain situations where you felt like the game has been lagging and you have found good solutions to move things forward, please let me know. Put it in comments, send me an email, let me know what you have found, because I'm very curious to hear other ways to solve what I consider to be a pretty big, hard problem when running tabletop role-playing games.